I want to talk to you today about human trafficking with an emphasis on sex trafficking. So, what is human trafficking? It truly is modern day slavery. It traps individuals in situations such as forced prostitution, labor, and debt bondage. Victims are recruited from vulnerable populations and promised prosperity, love, and security. Here are some stats on human trafficking. 14,500 individuals are estimated to be trafficked through the U.S. every year. 76 human trafficking tips were reported in Utah in 2018, 41 with high indicators of human trafficking. 49 calls were received on the human trafficking hotline in 2018 from victims and survivors of sex trafficking in Utah. The majority of Utah trafficking cases involve sex trafficking, which is why I'm primarily focusing on this type of trafficking. Social determinants of health. What are the barriers for the sex trafficked population? Availability of resources to meet daily needs such as safe housing can be a barrier, as well as access to health care, social support, and exposure to crime and violence. Safe housing. Living conditions can be inhumane, overcrowded, and lack basic needs such as personal hygiene items. Leaving a trafficker could result in homelessness. Oftentimes, this is why a victim doesn't try to leave. There's also a major lack of emergency housing for rescued victims of sex trafficking in Utah. I recently attended the 2020 Human Trafficking Symposium at the University of Utah, and this was a topic that was brought up. The lack of emergency housing. There's an organization planning on building a safe house for victims of sex trafficking called the Aspen Magdalene House, and I listed their email there. They're trying to raise money to build this home for survivors where they can receive their basic needs, therapy, treatment, job skill training, basically to give them a second chance at life. So if you're interested in helping in the cause of rehabilitating sex trafficking victims, this is a great place to start. Access to healthcare services. The victim may fear retribution from their trafficker. They also fear law enforcement, which can be barriers to accessing healthcare. Despite this, victims have been shown to seek care, but signs of trafficking are not recognized. 87.8% of human trafficking survivors have reported making contact with a healthcare provider while they were being trafficked. 63.3% of these contacts were in an emergency room. Social support. These victims lack social support and family support, which in the first place can lead to trafficking. A lack of social support, abuse, alienation while being trafficked lead to anxiety, depression, aggression, suicidal ideation, attention deficit, and PTSD. Exposure to crime and violence. More violence has occurred with sex trafficked women than non-trafficked sex workers. They are also exposed to drug use and addiction, and of course prostitution and the fear of being arrested. Sex trafficking victims are disproportionately affected by STDs, STIs, including Hep C and HIV, drug abuse and overdose, physical injuries from exposure to violence, emotional and psychological trauma. So, a root cause of a physical health disparity. I would like to focus on sexually transmitted infections and diseases. The root cause of a higher rate of STIs and STDs is simply the work that these women are forced or coerced into doing, which involves commercial sex acts. They may see as many as several dozen clients in a day, and 2/3 of sex trafficked women in one large study reported signs and symptoms of an STD, STI in the last few months. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For victims of sex trafficking, what is met and unmet? Starting at physiological needs and ending at self-actualization. Physiological needs. This may be lacking for some victims, but interestingly enough, in Utah, according to a Secure Strike Force agent who presented at the Human Trafficking Symposium, most victims have these basic needs met. They come and go from the residence of their trafficker as they please. And being trapped is not always physical. It can be emotional, psychological, tied to drug addiction and other threats. He also mentioned some traffickers buying their victims expensive clothes and designer handbags in an attempt to get them to stay. Lack of safety. These victims face violence and threats on a daily basis. Sex-trafficked women suppress emotions, thoughts, and memories and live in a partial state of denial in order to survive. A Utah case review on human trafficking and violence. This was presented at the trafficking symposium that I attended. So the case review is as follows. A woman presented to the emergency room severely beaten with her hair chopped off. The more they talked to her, they realized that she was a victim of sex trafficking and had been for quite some time. She told her trafficker that she was going to leave. And by the way, her trafficker was a 25-year-old woman who would hire men to be her muscle to help keep the girls in line. And she had 16 to 18 women trafficking for her. So she told her trafficker she was leaving. This trafficking woman took a belt buckle on a leather belt and severely beat the young woman. She then recruited her man that she hired as muscle, and they both just severely beat her, cracked her head open. She received 24 stitches in her scalp. They just severely beat her. And then this all happened in front of the other sex trafficking victims who lived in the home. She then told the other girls in the home to put her in the shower, clean her up, and she was forced to see clients for 10 hours for sex before she escaped the home and got herself to the emergency room. Luckily, both of these perpetrators were sent to prison for this. They went to court and they were convicted, but only about half of the girls would go against them in court because of pure fear. Lack of love and belonging. These victims lack family and friend support. They trust nobody. They have a skewed view of love, sex, and relationships. And oftentimes a poor home life can lead to trafficking in the first place. Lack of self-esteem and respect. They have a major lack of self-respect and love. Poor self-esteem. Oftentimes this is how they get coerced into trafficking in the first place. So another Utah case review. A man begins dating a younger teenage girl, treats her really good, takes her on dates, buys her expensive things. She falls in love with him. He then coerces her into sex trafficking to make him money. He does this with several women, and when he was finally caught, taken to court, she would not testify against him because she was still in love with him. So this just shows the means that these traffickers go to, exploiting other people for their own gain. Self-actualization. Can survivors reach this? Accepting who she is, realizing her capabilities, finding meaning, and developing an accurate perception of the world is required in order to reach self-actualization. Many survivors of sex trafficking require years of therapy before this can be a reality for them. What is the functional level of human trafficking victims? Overall, poor. They are tricked, lied to, threatened, beaten, humiliated, abused, attacked, raped, hooked on drugs, and forced or coerced into commercial sex acts. Nobody dealing with these things could function well. Health outcomes for sex trafficking victims. Of course, emotional issues, there's depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal ideation. Physical, we have STDs, violence, drug addiction, overdose, unplanned pregnancy leading to forced abortion, and risk of homicide. So what is Utah doing about human trafficking? Well, I attended the 2020 Human Trafficking Symposium. It was phenomenal. The Attorney General's office is doing a lot in Utah to fight human trafficking right now. UTIP, the Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force, is playing a big part, as well as the Secure Strike Force agents, who basically investigate and bring down these trafficking rings. What is happening nationally to combat human trafficking? President Trump signs an order to combat human trafficking, including a $42 million budget increase on January 31st, 2020, as a conclusion to Human Trafficking Awareness Month. This increase in budget has said to go to prosecuting traffickers and providing victim services across the nation, which is greatly needed in every state. So I have a link below to a little clip from the White House Summit hearing from a real survivor of human trafficking. Her story is really touching and inspiring. So I know my presentations reach the time limit, but if you'd like to, you can click on that link and watch that video clip. Just as a takeaway, I'd like to say that I think that mandatory training for all nurses in Utah should be put into place to train them to look for signs of human trafficking, how to report it, everything like that, especially seeing how many victims go through healthcare settings.